Union Pacific and Canadian National spent 3 times as much on dividends and buybacks as they did on capacity expansion, infrastructure maintenance, and equipment maintenance combined.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
I'm looking forward to this rail conversation, though. I know Rail Workers United has really been putting out the call for reforming our broken rail system. So, yeah, I'm excited to hear from them.
Let's go ahead and bring Maddock on the line. Maddock Thomas is an undergraduate at Brown University, concentrating in urban studies, and an avid transportation researcher, writer, and interlocutor. He's published and presented on a number of subjects relevant to railroads and public transportation, and is a Stone Fellow and former visiting researcher at the B&O Railroad Museum. Maddock, welcome to the Valley Labor Report. I appreciate your taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you for having me.
So your report is titled Putting America Back on Track, The Case for a 21st Century Public Rail System. And I guess the first question to ask about the report that you have here is why? Why do it? What was the impetus for getting your gears turning about public rail?
Yeah, so I would say a lot of it goes back to sort of a lot of the 2022 discussions around the rail strike, the conditions on the railroads, talking with rail workers, and then doing a little bit of research myself that sort of got me to the point of really coming to the conclusion that Railroad Workers United's call for public ownership of the railroads was correct, and not only necessary for rail workers, but also for farmers and businesses across the United States, for rail passengers. Because we've seen a drastic deterioration in both the quality of life for rail workers and the number of jobs on the railroads, but also in the amount of freight shipped by rail. We're shipping 30% fewer carloads than we were in 2000, and they're ripping up infrastructure, which impedes passenger service. It's preventing any sort of expansion into rail, which could take freight off our roads that would decongest our highways, help reduce carbon emissions. But the private duopolistic Class 1 railroads that own over 70% of all track in this country have no interest in doing that, much less providing any sort of decent working conditions to their employees.
So that was kind of the impetus of it. That was, the 2022 rail strike is kind of what got your gears turning about this. And when you say public rail ownership, my understanding of the railroad workers' call for rail ownership is that it's specifically literally the railroads, like the tracks and the ground that they're on. That is the proposal, to nationalize those, not necessarily the freight companies. Is that right?
I think that that's a discussion that's currently ongoing. There's a lot of questions surrounding what public rail would look like. I spend a section of my report talking about that. We're currently having both more discussions with stakeholders about what a public railroad should be structured as. But also I'm working on sort of a follow-up to this report that will delve more into the how do we get to the point of public ownership, and also what should it look like there? Because there is this idea of publicly owning the infrastructure. There's a lot of parts of the United States that already own a lot of rail infrastructure, especially sort of class 2 and 3 trackage, which is smaller branch lines generally. And those are owned by state DOTs. In my home state of Georgia, the GDOT owns 580 miles of track. And that's because the class 1s abandoned it. They didn't want to serve rural communities anymore, decided it wasn't profitable enough. And so the state had to step in and take control of that infrastructure to maintain service, which is very necessary to a lot of businesses and a lot of agricultural enterprises and sort of smaller scale operations. And so that's sort of a model that's very easy to take and expand now, is just owning the infrastructure and leasing out or franchising operations to still private companies. But I personally am of the opinion that we also need to have some discussions about taking operations into public control, because just owning the infrastructure alone, I don't think is going to get us to the point where we're truly operating the railroads as a public utility, as a public service. And being able to guarantee both the high quality service to customers that uh, might want to ship by rail, but who aren't given the quality of service or reliability from the class ones to ship by rail right now, and are sort of forced to take trucks or other means of transportation that might be worse for the environment or more expensive, leading to higher costs for consumers. And so that's potentially one of the benefits of taking the whole system as a public utility. But it's certainly something that continues to be debated and discussed.
When you kind of step back and take a look at rails, in the context of the broader transportation system, they really are kind of uniquely privatized, right? I mean, the highways are owned by the government. The FAA is government run and oversees like flights and things like this, and there's a lot of government involvement there. And yet the rails, the actual infrastructure is privately owned. And then also the companies that operate on top of them are privately owned. It's actually even out of step with the kind of modus operandi of even capitalist America, much less, other countries. And so I guess, maybe a good place to dive into would be you have a section on the history of public rail in America. And so how did it happen that the rail system is so uniquely privatized, even in a country like America where lots of politicians love privatization? How is it that so many other parts of our transportation system are actually under public control and the rails are not?
Sure. So, I mean, sort of the two parts of that question being the situation of the railroad and the situation elsewhere. Um, at the end of the day, very few transportation systems make a profit on their own. And so, as a result, you have to have subsidies somewhere in the system in order to have a reliable, robust transportation network. And that's meant our inland waterways, which, like railroads, and roads before them, when they had no competition, could make a decent profit moving freight, say on the Erie Canal. But then railroads came along and took a lot of that business. But there's still people relying on those inland waterways, and so the government maintains them at this point, so that that is an option for people who don't have a link to railroad or can't ship by truck. And a similar situation, of course, in the highways. Highways themselves do not fund operations. At one point, they were funded by the Highway Trust Fund, but now they have to take a lot of money from the general fund in Congress in order to pay for their expenses, because we haven't raised the gas tax or any other means of paying into the Highway Trust Fund in decades. But it's still a critical service and needs provisioned. And if we were just having a bunch of private highways around the country, we wouldn't have this sort of common carrier sense where everyone has access to use this infrastructure, which is necessary because so many people are trying to use it. And if we had a system of 400 different toll roads across the country, nobody would ever get anywhere because they'd just be paying tolls every 5 feet. But the railroads are a slightly different situation, and you brought up sort of the general pastiche of American capitalism. Railroads are interesting because a lot of people point to the fact that they actually predate capitalism in a way, going back to the 1830s, before really the Industrial Revolution took place and sort of industrial capitalism rose in this country. The very first large enterprises were trustified railroads. And of course, in the early days, there was no capital. The private investors weren't interested in railroads because they saw them as too risky. Ironically, of course, capitalists who very frequently portray themselves as deserving of profits because they take risks were not willing to take risks on a new mode of transportation back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in the 19th century. And so state governments and municipalities funded those early railroads. But once it was seen that railroads were a profitable means of transportation, there was pressure to privatize those that were publicly owned. And it began to attract more investment for private operations. The other aspect of this is that Congress made a very conscious decision not to directly build and operate the a public rail system in the 19th century, and instead gave away more than 139 million acres of public land to private corporations on the condition they build railroads. They got a bunch of free land, they got government subsidies, and they built the transcontinental railroads and the Illinois Central going down the middle of the country. And so, not exactly free from government intervention, but because the government chose to give this land to private corporations as an incentive to construct the railroads, they then could very cheaply build them privately, and they've remained held privately ever since, to a large degree, except of course for those abandonments, a lot of public passenger infrastructure exists. And then you get into the 20th century, and then you have the issues with the highway system comes into place, and you see a lot more competition with trucks, and railroads start failing and going bankrupt. And at that point, you see sort of a resurgence of some public ownership of rail infrastructure because try to shed some of their unprofitable or less profitable routes so that the bones of what remains is an uber profitable set of main lines that they can invest the bare minimum in and suck cash out of.
Mm, mm. And so, so there are some public rails, but they keep the private companies have kept the super really profitable rail lines. Is that right?
In general, yeah, there are certain high density freight routes that happen to be publicly owned, but those tend to be ones that were constructed by state governments back in the 19th century, and they've just held on to them till this day. For example, in Georgia, the Western Atlantic Railroad goes between Chattanooga and Atlanta, owned by the state of Georgia, leased to CSX, and then the North Carolina Railroad, which runs along the bones of all the major cities in North Carolina, in Greensboro, Raleigh, Durham. That's also owned by the state of North Carolina, but these date back for a long time, and they've been leased for operations to the class ones.
Gotcha. And so, so we have an extremely privatized transportation system in rail, arguably the most privatized transportation system in the United States. Certainly one of the most privatized rail systems in the world. And so if you're a lover of capitalism and you think the profit motive is great and always has great outcomes when it's pursued, the anticipation that I think that a lot of people would have is that our rail system is the best, actually. The rails are the best transportation system in the country because they're the most privatized, and our rail system is the best rail system in the world because of how privatized it is. And so, is that what your report found? Did you find that the rails operate very well? They're very efficient. They they have adequate profits. They're great for the communities. They're great for the workers. They're great for the customers. Everything's great. Is that what's going on?
That's what the Association of American Railroads would have you believe. The sort of the lobbying arm for the rail industry. They like to point that we have the most productive railroads in the world. Essentially means we have the most exploitation of workers on any railroad system in the world. They've achieved this world-leading productivity by laying off massive amounts of workers and by cutting service to any community they can that they don't find to be a high enough profit margin. And so the US may have on paper some very good statistics, but once you peel back the cover of what that means, it means that they have abandoned service to so many rural communities around the country, and even to small cities and towns that once got a lot of rail service. You're not seeing that anymore because they've decided to concentrate on essentially becoming conveyor belts from coast to coast for intermodal containers and coal. Even Baltimore lost an intermodal terminal back in 2018 when CSX was going into precision schedule railroading because they decided, well, they can just drive an extra couple hundred miles and pick up their containers by truck, which of course means people don't ship by rail because at that point, why not leave it on a truck for a longer distance? You've also got the question of actual freight carried. It's pointed out that we have some of the highest freight haulage by any rail system in the world. It's a bit of a mixed bag because you look at it and our ton mileage is fairly high, but it has a lot to do with the distances that things are traveling, and we're not shipping a lot of freight that could be shipped by rail. It's going to trucks because of inconsistent service. Um, we're shipping about the same tonnage annually as Indian Railways, and we're doing, of course, over slightly longer distances. But does that mean that our rail system is necessarily better or worse? Not necessarily. Um, as far as service quality, I think that the STB, Surface Transportation Board hearings in 2022 were very revelatory on this fact. The Association of Sandstone and Gravel producers gave a comment that rail service is the worst that it has ever been. And I've had the privilege to talk with some shippers and, of course, read all of this testimony for the STB. And they talk about the fact that they sign contracts with the class ones that say we're going to get switching service. They're going to deliver cars and they're going to pick up cars loaded with our cargo from our siding at our factory 7 days a week. But the railroads have decided that they just don't want to do that anymore. They've laid off so many people they don't actually have folks to run those trains, or they just don't feel like running them because they decided it's not quite profitable enough, even though it's still often cases, it's still profitable traffic. They're just not pursuing it. And so they'll say, okay, we're actually coming 2 days a week, and they won't tell folks when they're coming until the day of, in some cases. And this leads to dramatic amounts of instability for people that rely on rail. A lot of manufacturers and farmers are struggling these days to get rail service. And it ends up hurting the American economy and workers who depend on that rail shipment for their jobs. If you're not getting a delivery at the factory, there's no work to do at the factory. And that's the situation the railroads have left us in. On the other hand, they're making a lot of money. They've done this by focusing only on the most profitable routes and the most profitable traffic at the expense of all the slightly lower margin traffic that they might be moving, and underinvesting in infrastructure so that they can take all of those profits and they can suck it out of the industry and give it back to their shareholders in the form of dividends and buybacks. One of the figures I point to in the report is that Union Pacific and Canadian National, two Class 1 railroads, in 2022, if you look at their annual reports, they spent 3 times as much on dividends and buybacks as they did on capacity expansion, infrastructure maintenance, and equipment maintenance combined.
Wow.
And so, sure, most profitable railroads in the world, but are they the best? I think that most stakeholders would say no.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
And what about you're working for you did this report for Railroad Workers United. I'm not exactly sure what the relationship is of you to that organization, but what is the how has this organization of rail transportation treated working people, specifically those who work for the rails?
This gets into a much longer conversation than I think we have time to today.
I thought it was going to be
you've
very
had
quick. I
members
figured
of
you just told me these are the most profitable rail companies in the world, and so I've been told reliably from reliable sources that this always trickles down to people, right? If you give tax cuts, then the owners' beneficence will increase wages and things like this. I figured that would be a very short statement.
Yeah, I think that the trickle down effect is true in this circumstance if what you're talking about is job cuts, in that the profitability trickles down to furloughs and layoffs. We've lost one of the figures, if you want to really compartmentalize the issue of the rail industry, that I can point to is that since 2000, we've had a 30% drop in carloads carried by rail. Since 2013 until 2022, we've seen a 30% cut in rail workers employed in the industry, and we've seen a 30% rise in the accident rate among railroads. And so that's not only threatening workers, but it's also threatening community live alongside these rail lines. But when you have a 30% cut in all employment in an industry, you have a massive speed up, and you don't have enough people to do the jobs properly. And so now you've got 40% of all locomotive engineers and conductors report being highly fatigued, according to an FRA study. And that's highly fatigued. That's not all fatigued workers. This is of the group surveyed by the FRA that meets some legal standard set by a federal agency for highly fatigued. And you have people now who might have, back when there was fuller staffing on the railroad, been able to bid for and get a regular job operating a local train, where they would be able to go home to their family. They would know they have a regular schedule each week. People are longer and longer staying on what's called the extra board, where they don't know which train they're working any given day until they get a call 2 hours ahead of time. So that might be at 3 a.m., might be at 9 p.m. And so you have a very irregular work schedule. And then you're working long shifts, often with inconsistent replacement crews coming. And these longer and longer trains are unwieldy, and you still have the same number of people crewing them, but the railroads are still trying to push for one person train operations, which would leave one engineer with no second pair of eyes or anyone to go check issues on the train when something comes uh, into appearance. Uh, and that's already scary enough with the job cuts that we've seen. In other crafts on the railroad, you have carmen and machinists who work on locomotives and engineers and engines who are vastly understaffed, dealing with maintaining the same number of locomotives and cars, but with maybe a third or more fewer people. And as a result, you've got rail companies essentially telling workers, don't actually do the inspection that you're supposed to do. Don't do the job we trained you to do. We're not in the business of fixing rail cars. We're in the business of moving freight. And a consequence of this is you see that when the FRA inspects Union Pacific's equipment, 72% of their locomotives have federal defects. 25% of the cars on the train that derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, had federal defects. And this has a terrible impact on both workers' health because they're having to work faster and faster pace. They're working more and more forced overtime because the railroads don't have enough staffing to actually do their jobs properly with enough people. But they're being sped up and then told at the end of the day when they thought they were going to be able to go pick up their child, oh, you actually you have to stay on for another 12 other hour shift overnight. And they have little to no say in that. So it's turned what used to be a very good union job with decent pay and benefits into somewhat of a nightmare.
Mm, mm. And so, so there are several other arguments for increased or for public rail and the use of the rail system, and some of those have to do with the environment and the communities, and you mentioned traffic congestion and things like this, and getting basically moving some of the transportation from like 18-wheelers to rails. What would, talk to us about some of those things? Like, what would be the advantage theoretically if we were able to move more transportation from the roads to the rails? What would be some of the advantages? And then how could we make that happen?
Sure. So one of the key advantages of getting trucks off the road is that the amount of damage that a vehicle does to a road surface increases exponentially with its weight. And so trucks do a lot more damage to road surfaces than cars do. And we have the potential to move a lot of the traffic that currently travels by truck, move that onto trains, which would get trucks off the road, which would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, would reduce congestion on key corridors, but potentially also provide some more stability to truck drivers if we have the core of the long distance routes across this country going by rail. Then people can pick up and deliver at the endpoints by truck, and they also would get more ability to have sort of time with their families and at home, and a better work-life balance. But the other aspect of this is reducing the amount of money that we have to spend on our highways would save a lot of public funds that are currently being spent on maintaining bridges, especially as we shift to EVs and heavier vehicles writ large. Getting some of that weight off the road will save tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars in maintenance every year. At the same time, both reducing those carbon emissions has the impact of hopefully softening the blow of climate change. But also investing in freight will reduce the footprint of the road widenings that keep happening across this country that don't reduce congestion, but they destroy neighborhoods. And so you can move freight a lot more more efficiently by rail within sort of a much smaller 50-foot wide space in 2 tracks than you could with a 400-foot wide highway. It's still a higher throughput. Not to say anything of the additional benefits of we could provide better passenger service if we're actually investing in infrastructure. And the impact on communities is both reducing the pollution coming from trucking and the congestion that comes from an over-reliance on trucking in many communities, but also the emissions and the pollution that come from diesel locomotives. We can see that there's been a push over time to reduce the nitrous oxide and particulate matter emissions from trucks. The EPA has promulgated rules that require a higher tier of emission standards for locomotives, but the railroads haven't been investing in those. And over the period between 2017 and 2020, they actually have shifted to dirtier, more polluting locomotives in their rail yards, which for both the rail workers who work in and around these locomotives every day and for the communities that are living near them, we see up to 10 times higher risks of cancer and other lung diseases and health impacts that are coming from the fact that we are choosing, or the class ones are actively choosing to continue to use these locomotives rather than considering serious solutions like catenary electrification. Every other country in the world that is thinking about electrification seriously right now is thinking about catenary and putting up electrification that will decarbonize the rail system, which on its own is not a huge change in emissions, but electric locomotives are 30% cheaper to operate and maintain and purchase. They accelerate and decelerate faster. It allows us to run much faster, more frequent passenger service on corridors. And so there's a bunch of other ancillary benefits that would lead to a mode shift of we can run trains more efficiently, and then we can get trains to serve more customers when that can be done at a lower cost because we have eliminated the fuel expenses that are a significant portion of operating costs for trains right now. But it also gets back to we're gonna, in this regime of precision scheduled railroading, we're no longer gonna abandon rural communities and small shippers, and instead be able to actually serve them with local trains and end-to-end rail shipping. These are things that you'd think would be possible under our current rail system, but the class ones have no desire to go after even low margin profitable traffic, to say nothing of sort of at cost traffic that might be able to be served under a public system and shift some of that back to rail, which would have all the benefits I mentioned above, but also create tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of jobs, both in constructing and maintaining additional rail infrastructure to have that capacity, but also to operate those trains and maintain them.
And so, I think you're making a good case that we should be moving more things to, more transportation to the rails. Made a very strong case that the private ownership of the rails has not been very effective, and so then the question becomes: what are some of the best avenues available to move to a more nationalized system of rail ownership, and what are some of the various options available to us? You spoke earlier in the conversation about the idea that we should just own the tracks versus maybe we should own the tracks and the operators. What does the path look like, and what are some potential destinations?
So there's a variety of routes. And of course, I think multiple avenues are worth exploring. The sort of shameless plug for the campaign is that we need folks to get involved in public rail now. And we want to build a movement that can actually shift the dialogue on a national level to start thinking about our rail system, why it's so broken, what it could look like under public ownership, and begin to build that pressure and that momentum to eventually have a fully publicly owned rail system. But some of the more technical avenues for doing that, there is the option of just buy them out. It's been proposed before. It's not cheap, but issuing federal debt at fairly low interest rates, with the amount of profit these railroads rake in right now, we could pay off the cost of purchasing them within 10 to 20 years. And then we would have a debt-free, publicly owned rail system with all of the equipment, all of the tracks. There's also the sort of state-by-state approach. We currently see, say, the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority has been buying trackage from Norfolk Southern CSX so that they can create their own dedicated rights of way and tracks along freight rights of way that just serve passengers so that they can run more frequent passenger service. It's a good approach for a lot of places that have commuter rail or passenger rail already or interested in running it is buying out the rails. And then leveraging some of the public assets we already have. The Huey P. Long Bridge in New Orleans, owned by the Public Belt Railway of New Orleans, publicly owned. I've seen statistics that it carries 1/3 of the east-west rail traffic in the United States. It maybe as a condition of operating over that bridge, we start putting more pressure on the railroads to act as better members of the community, treat their workers better. Similarly, the Moffat Tunnel out in the west, owned by the state of Colorado, operated by Union Pacific. The lease comes up in just a few short months, and once that lease runs out, it needs to be renegotiated. Maybe conditions as a part of that can have to do with sort of the better operations on the part of Union Pacific. And in addition to purchasing state by state, one of the angles that I'm very interested in, and certainly we need more legal minds thinking about and analyzing, is that I mentioned the land grants earlier. The land grants, the actual land that was given away acre by acre in a checkerboard pattern on either side of the railroad was given away and then sold by the railroads. But a close reading of the land grants has been suggested by a few scholars that the actual rights of way that the tracks operate over are easements given by the federal government, that the federal government never transferred the title to the private railroads. And so with that in mind, and the fact that Congress explicitly said in each of the land grant acts that they have the right to amend, repeal, add to these grants at any point, we could pressure Congress into amending the land grant, say that they've broken the public trust. The railroads no longer serve the public interest like they were supposed to when this land was given to them by Congress. And we could grant that easement instead to a public corporation. Whether that would immediately mean operations publicly, or if it would just mean in the meantime that some sort of lease that brings in a lot of revenue to fund other public rail operations, is up for more discussion. Sort of depends on what the situation is at the moment. But many of the large high density Western rail lines, and even some of them in the middle of the country and even Florida inexplicably, were land grants from the federal government to some extent, and still is public land underlying that rail infrastructure. So that's one angle that we could leverage to take our railroads back.
All right. Maddox, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Adam, do you have anything?
No, I really enjoyed that. I appreciate you breaking it down, and I think you made a really compelling case. And, as someone who thinks that we are really missing a lot of opportunities with trains and the rail system in this country, compared to so many others, I really appreciate what you're doing. And I appreciate the campaign from Rail Workers United. If you could just plug that one more time for folks who are interested in getting more involved in this.
Sure. So Railroad Workers United, sort of one of the groups that kicked off this campaign. It's a cross-craft caucus of rail workers. Go to their website, railroadworkersunited.com. If you're interested in supporting Railroad Workers United, you can donate. You can actually join as a solidarity member. If you're not a rail worker, join as a full voting member if you are a rail worker. And then the campaign is now larger than Railroad Workers United. It also includes United Electrical Workers, which has declared for public rail ownership, and a number of other groups that have gotten together and decided this is the way forward. And so you can join our movement. You can donate, you can get involved. If you go to our website, publicrailnow.org, there is a banner at the top of the screen. You can click it. It'll send you to a form to get involved. Fill that out. You can check box. Our organizer, Adam Barrington, will get in contact with you, talk to you about how public rail might impact you, current impacts in your community from rail, and how you want to get involved with the movement. And so we'd love you to reach out, get involved, support us, give your time, donate, just give us a follow on social media. We're at Public Rail Now pretty much everywhere. And stay tuned. We'll be doing more events all around the country, and this certainly is the beginning of the campaign, not the end.
All right, Maddox Thomas, the paper is called Putting America Back on Track, the case for a 21st century public rail system. You can read the full 110-page report. You should put it out like a book or something. You should make a book of it. And you can find it on railroadworkersunited.org. Maddox, thanks again. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.